the federal minister responsible for mental health and addictions, Yara Sachs, granting BC's request to roll back part of a drug decriminalization pilot project currently underway in that province that decriminalized the possession of small amounts of hard drugs. More than a week ago, the province reached out to the feds seeking to amend that policy to restrict hard drug use in public spaces. Here's how today's announcement played out in question period.
Does he believe that people should be allowed to smoke meth or crack in children's soccer fields?
Obviously, no one in this House does. That is why we agreed with the British Columbia government to modify their pilot project.
Even the radical NDP government in BC asked for him to reverse his decriminalization. Why did it take him 10 days and 66 more deaths to do it?
Once again, we see the leader of the opposition trying to score cheap political points on the backs of vulnerable people to promote an ideology that does not work.
Let's unpack what you just heard with the front bench. With me tonight, former Liberal New Brunswick Premier Brian Gallant. He's the CEO of Space Canada now. Rona Ambrose is a former leader of the Conservative Party and now Deputy Chairwoman at TD Securities. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, as is journalist and author Paul Wells. He's here with me in studio. His newest book, Governing in Troubled Times, Justin Trudeau on the Ropes, happens to be out there. It is today. Hi, everybody. Really good to see you. Tom, I'll start with you. This is dominated. This issue, a debate over drug policy in BC, has dominated a question period for since BC essentially made that request. Today, the feds, as we said in the introduction, approved it. Why do you just before a question period? Why do you think it remained at the forefront of debate that occurred in the House today?
Well, it's because it's another one of those issues that Pierre Poilievre spotted a whole long time ago. I mean, he was on housing, long before anybody else started realizing how hot an issue it was. And he would go into BC, he'd show up in downtown East Side where there were serious problems with people using hard drugs in open spaces, in public areas. And he was on it. And he was taking a very tough approach, law and order, go back, start having proper resources to treat people, but we're not just going to allow them to use drugs anywhere. So he was all over this thing. The NDP government in British Columbia is facing a general election this October. That's just around the corner in political terms, Vashi. So they had to get bail from this thing fast. Trudeau did take a little bit of time, but frankly, 10 days, given the glacial pace of the public administration, is not that long. But he's just trying to get away from this thing right now. And there's even going to be a request, apparently, from Toronto to get some more latitude on these things. Look, this is one of those great experiments gone awry. If you talk to social workers, if you talk to community workers, you talk to people who work with those with addictions and drugs and mental illness, and they're often together. Sometimes the drugs cause the mental illness. Sometimes the mental illness drove people to hard drugs. But they do go together, and that's why it's smart to have a minister in charge of that issue. But it just turned into an absolute debacle. And it was ungovernable, and they started to realize it, and it was going to become a political stone around their necks, and they were just not going to be able to talk their way out of it. So given everything that happened, Trudeau had no choice. He had to give BC what they were asking for. But I think there's still going to be a pretty heavy price to pay for the NDP government, and I think it's going to stick to Trudeau a fair bit for a while as well. And that's why, of course, Poilievre is still on it.
Well, Tom mentioned that, Rona, that the Prime Minister, and you can sense sort of the federal government is trying to not talk about it as much, I guess, is the way to say it. For example, I just had the minister on and asked her about the Toronto project and whether that would go ahead, and they're very cautious in the way they're answering that. They may not want to be at the forefront of this. My guess is the Conservatives will keep hammering on the issue, despite now the issue in BC from a federal exemption perspective being put to bed.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all expect as Canadians that when a public policy has unintended consequences, that public policy makers say, whoa, we made a mistake here, and instead of becoming political or ideological about it, they say, let's pivot. And so that's what the BC government has done. Kudos to the BC government. But let's be clear here. All that has happened is the recriminalization of hard drugs like crack and cocaine and heroin in public spaces. They're still legal in many other spaces, so there is still a project or an experiment happening to see if this is the right approach. And I think the reason Pierre is pushing hard on this is because I don't think the Prime Minister or the Addictions Minister has admitted that perhaps there are grave unintended consequences. And so when we ask about what about Toronto's request, what about Montreal's request, perhaps we should be rethinking all of these requests, because there has been, we've seen firsthand what has happened in British Columbia. And if you spend any time in British Columbia, in Vancouver, and in fact, you're seeing it in downtown Toronto, downtown Calgary, downtown Edmonton, it is very, very tragic. And anyone who cares about these issues wants to see more recovery, more investment in treatment. If you read the research from around the world, we know that one can't happen without the other. So we've tried the experiment, we've tried harm reduction at an extreme level, and now we need to pull that back and we need to invest heavily in treatment. And we haven't done that. So I really hope that that's something that the Trudeau government will admit and start to put resources behind.
As far as rethinking kind of the project more largely, Brian, I don't think that they're being, to Rona's point, they're not being explicit that they are. But if you read between the lines of half of the interview that I just conducted, for example, it really appears that way. Like they're not willing to come out and say, well, if the conditions are right, we will go ahead with what Toronto is doing. We do believe this will save lives, even though they say that to some degree, like they won't be specific about it with Toronto. Do you anticipate that moving forward, they will be really hesitant to give the okay to other jurisdictions?
They'll definitely be a lot more hesitant. And I think in the case of Toronto, as you pointed out, Vashi, in your interview with the minister, if the province of Ontario is not on board, I don't see how and why they would move forward with it. If they don't have the partner that is responsible for healthcare, I think that it would certainly put the project, in Toronto's case, at risk, to say the least, if it could even get off the ground. And on top of that, why would they do it? I mean, politically speaking, it would be a very difficult position to be in to try to go alone with the city. So on the how and the why, it just doesn't, I think, add up. For BC, I mean, one thing I would point out, Canada's lucky to have all the provinces and territories that we have for many reasons, but one of them also includes that, for many evident reasons, but one of them includes also the fact that we can try things. We can have a province or even a region in a city in this case, try things out, and that's on paper a good thing, because you can pilot these things. If they work, fantastic. You can then scale up when appropriate. If they don't work, you can scale down, and hopefully not too much damage was caused. So really, from a public policy development point of view, on paper, that's a really great thing. And it's unfortunate, though, that from a political point of view, you're taking a big risk, because when you try to do something that is sort of outside of the box and it doesn't work, which is often the case when it's a pilot project, then politically speaking, it's certainly red meat, for the lack of a better term. So that's what we're seeing here. And often what ends up happening is that it then becomes something that people don't want to touch, even if, as Rona mentioned,
right,
the other components of the pilot work out well, because there's now this sort of black cloud over it. It'll be tougher for any government in the future to do something similar.
And I think it's interesting that that's the case, because the stakes are pretty high. I mean, there are 42,000 people in this country who have died since 2016 from overdoses, Paul.
Yeah.
It is a very serious issue. And even in BC, the other part of the stakes are that public safety was, a lot of different people felt put at risk. And so it's not a debate without consequence.
Yeah. Do you know who the stakes are highest for? Is the people who use drugs, who are desperately addicted to incredibly dangerous substances. And when policymakers arrange it so that they can't use legal drugs in public, they will use illegal drugs in private, and their chances of dying of an overdose instead of being resuscitated skyrockets. Rona was right, that the things that we're seeing in Vancouver are very similar to the things we're seeing in Edmonton. Until 18 months ago, people used to like to draw a distinction between the horrible policy in British Columbia and the much more enlightened policy in Alberta. Pierre Poilievre wrote an op-ed in the National Post at the beginning of 2023 saying we should follow the Alberta example. Here's the Alberta example. 2023 was the deadliest year for opioid fatalities in Alberta history. He doesn't make that comparison anymore. Everywhere, the problem is the drug. Fentanyl is orders of magnitude more dangerous than anyone else, and than any of the previous drugs that we thought were the worst we'd ever seen. And I'm very worried that as we play these political games, the people who are most at risk will be in greater danger.